Sun-soaked beaches, clear blue waters, a taste of paradise. Until all hell broke loose and the earth unleashed its fury. First, a massive earthquake, one of the worst ever. Then a mega tsunami, wreaking untold destruction. On December 26, 2004, people stared in wonder as the ocean rolled back into the distance. A few minutes later, it returned, growing as it surged forward, rearing up and roaring like several freight trains as it pounded the shore. Locals and holidaymakers were caught completely by surprise. Desperately, they tried to outrun the torrent of water as it began to race inland, pummeling and smashing all in its path. Trees, buildings, boats and furniture were picked up and carried, becoming further instruments of death and injury. The loss of human life was on a monumental scale. Survival was virtually a matter of chance, timing, and luck.
And I heard a lot of screaming and commotion and just a lot of noise, wondered what it was. So I went from there to just to the corner of the car park here by the main road, looked down the street, and I could see a lot of people running and screaming and shouting, and I could hear everyone shouting, "Big wave, big wave." I still didn't really twig what was going on. A couple of seconds later, there's a little alleyway between the shops there, and the water came through at about 2 meters high. So then I just ran.
When the tsunami's power was finally spent, the extent of the devastation was revealed. Closest to the earthquake's epicenter, Indonesia was hit particularly hard. But the tsunami had traveled far, reaching many countries, and always leaving behind a trail of destruction and misery. Thousands of kilometers of coastline had been decimated, villages inundated, and lives shattered. Millions of people had no homes, no sanitation, clean water or food. This was a humanitarian emergency of an unprecedented scale. For holidaymakers, December is a perfect time to visit Phuket, Thailand's largest island and popular tourist spot. At Christmas, the weather is ideal, hot but dry. The island's seemingly endless beaches attract people from all over the globe. Its squeaky clean white sand and turquoise waters an irresistible lure. It's a bleak cry from European winters, half a world away from sleet, snow and slush. Here, there's time out from the stresses of everyday living. All you have to do is relax. Early on the morning of the 26th of December, the lazy day after Christmas, it was shaping up to be yet another perfect day. On the beaches, all was calm. But far out in the ocean, a cataclysmic event was unfolding. Just before 8 in the morning, a massive earthquake 30 kilometers beneath the Indian Ocean ripped open the earth, gouging out a 1,600-kilometer-long trench. the coastal Indonesian city of Banda Aceh, just 160 kilometers from the epicenter, bore the brunt. The tremendous upheaval and pressure of the earthquake forced the seafloor to rise several meters. 30 cubic kilometers of seawater was pushed upwards, radiating out along the entire length of the trench as a series of deadly tsunamis. In Aceh province, at least 150,000 died or were never found, the majority women and children. 500,000 people were homeless. The water destroyed over 800 kilometers of coastline, rushing up to 5 kilometers inland. The tsunami was so powerful that as it surged back to the ocean, many who had survived the initial waves were now swept out to sea. Boats, cars, trucks were picked up and carried by the waters, wreaking further havoc. Entire villages and towns disappeared. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals were decimated. Suddenly, virtually the entire infrastructure of Banda Aceh was gone. When the waters finally receded, they revealed a disaster of almost biblical proportions. Only a mosque stood amidst this field of death and destruction. Towns had literally been obliterated. Only the foundations remained, along with some debris. The rest had been carried away by the seething waters. Corpses were already beginning to rot in the tropical climate. The injured were in desperate need of medical attention. Banda Aceh was ground zero of one of the worst ever natural disasters.
I do hope you could report the sufferings of the people here in Aceh. The last 3 days have been the most difficult days of my presidency and a trying moment for my nations.
For 28 years, Aceh had been fighting a war for independence. Yet, in a matter of just minutes, almost 4 times as many people were killed by the tsunami than in the decades of civil war.
It does remind me of the pictures we see of Nagasaki or Hiroshima, where there was just, I think, one building, one cathedral standing, a gutted cathedral standing, and the rest was leveled, a leveled plain of shards. And that's more or less the situation here. We have one big building to our left, and the rest is just nothing except debris.
Aceh's real death toll will now never be known. For health reasons, those bodies that were recovered were given a hasty mass burial. Around the globe, a horrified public watched as the tsunami toppled communities like dominoes. International governments and aid agencies moved quickly to provide essential services to stricken areas.
What we're doing here in Banda Aceh is providing potable drinking water for the local people of Banda Aceh after the tidal wave. What we can do is 20,000 litres of potable, disinfected, safe drinking water per hour.
With thousands of dead bodies, sewage lines ruptured and water supplies contaminated, malaria, cholera and other diseases lurked in the wings. The race was now on to contain the disaster. The 9.3 magnitude earthquake had released surface energy equivalent to 1,500 Hiroshima bombs. This force triggered a succession of waves racing through deep water at 1,000 kilometers per hour, hitting Sri Lanka within 2 hours. Here, there was no receding sea to forewarn. The first wave hit not as it ebbed, but fully crested. 2/3 of the country's coastline suffered massive damage. Entire villages were swept away, and 80% of the fishing fleets and harbors were destroyed. 1 kilometer inland, an overloaded passenger train was lifted by the waters and wrecked, killing 1,800 people. Coming literally out of the blue, the tsunami caught people completely unaware.
And suddenly we saw the water advanced. To start with, we thought it was just the sea really just going a little angry. Then the second wave was a lot stronger, and we rushed upstairs. It happened a few times with about an hour in between. And the third wave that hit the hotel devastated the bottom half, the lower floors and so on. And we were trapped on the 3rd floor.
We were in the room when the big wave came, and then it broke the big window, and all of a sudden it was full of water, the whole room. Then it broke the door, and all the furniture went against the door, so the door was jammed, and we were trapped, my wife especially. And after a while I was could swim outside, and then I got jammed again on the outside, and I thought I'd get drowned, you know.
The recovery process was daunting. Rebuilding Sri Lanka's infrastructure, housing and industries would take years and billions of dollars.
I think for another 4 or 5 years we won't be able to raise our heads, to put the place in order. My property, I think I have a lot of damages here to put the walls up and to rebuild the building back,
Sri Lanka was the hardest hit area after Banda Aceh. 100,000 houses were destroyed, over 1 million people displaced, and around 40,000 lost their lives. On Thailand's west coast, most areas were badly hit. Close to 5,500 people died in the country, including many foreign tourists. In Phuket, there were around 250 deaths, and the fishing industry and tourist resorts sustained extensive damage. On one beach, the sea's rapid 300-meter retreat prompted locals and tourists to gather on the exposed seabed amidst flopping beached fish. All were trapped when the water surged back in. Elsewhere, a 10-year-old British girl, seeing the water recede, remembered a recent geography lesson and frantically warned beachgoers, saving 100 lives. Near neighbour of Phuket is Koh Phi Phi, an archipelago of 6 islands. The largest island houses a popular resort on a strip of land between 2 picturesque bays. A 2.5-meter wave struck first from one bay, and shortly after from the other side, a second wave, 5.5 meters high. 70% of the town's buildings were destroyed. 200 holiday bungalows were carried out to sea, some occupied at the time. By the middle of the following year, 2,000 people were known to be dead or missing. Local tour guides, however, believed the real figure to be double that amount. India suffered the 3rd most fatalities, with an estimated 18,000 deaths, and the state of Tamil Nadu was hit very hard. The human tragedy was heartbreaking. So many of the dead were children, swept away by the water in front of horrified parents. Bodies were dumped randomly as the waves left, in trees, tangled in power lines, half buried in muddy slopes. Fishing suffered severely. Only 3 of 15,000 boats were not damaged during the tsunami. Plantations and fields were poisoned by seawater and layers of sediment. It would need a very long time for this region to recover. The tsunamis traveled far, registering on meters in the Antarctic, Canada, and South America. A young man taking his first ever swim became Kenya's sole casualty.
Naomba kuondoka na meteorological department, manake wanasema kwamba bahari maji yatainuka 20 meters above the normal sea level na ni hatari. Kwa hivyo jamaa, mnaomba mapema kuondoka.
16 hours after the quake and 8,500 kilometers away, the tsunami reached South Africa, where it claimed 2 lives. In Somalia, almost 300 were estimated to have died. Even so far away, the waves were still lethal. During the afternoon, 18 months later, an undersea earthquake of magnitude 7.7 struck off the coast of Java, Indonesia. Within about 20 minutes, a 3-meter-high tsunami slammed into a 180-kilometer stretch of coastline. Witnesses described it as a black wall of water that surged several hundred meters inland. Hundreds of low-lying fishing villages were inundated, and houses, resorts, boats and shops were smashed to pieces. The tsunami caused major destruction and loss of life. The confirmed number of dead and missing was well over 700. Around 70,000 people were left homeless, and many thousands fled the area, terrified of further waves. For decades, the Pacific Ocean region had used an extensive tsunami warning system. But until 2004, the Indian Ocean region was not considered at risk, and no warning systems were in place. Clearly, that had to change.
We are starting up the world's most advanced tsunami early warning system, able to issue the quickest possible warnings with a high degree of reliability.
The complex system can predict, map, and warn of an impending tsunami just minutes after an earthquake.
Keberadaan sistem peringatan dini tsunami merupakan wujud kemajuan dan kesiapsiagaan kita dalam upaya mencegah atau paling tidak dalam upaya mengurangi dampak dari bahaya gempa bumi dan tsunami yang dapat timbul kapan saja dan di mana saja.
In 2009, 18 countries took part in an Indian Ocean tsunami drill to test public preparedness and data communications. It began with a mock earthquake. In Indonesia, the nationwide drill was realistic, involving young and old, even pregnant women, as a true test of a likely emergency. Within minutes of the earthquake, emergency procedures began. Wailing sirens and loudspeakers alerted people to head for higher ground and quake-proof emergency shelters. The military emergency response was enacted, and fake wounded, complete with bandages, were assisted by friends and relatives in a simulation of the 2004 tsunami. The test achieved its aims. People understood what they had to do, and any procedural and communication flaws were exposed and remedied. It was a valuable and worthwhile exercise, although for many a little too realistic, a frightening reminder of 2004. Unlike many other regions, the post-tsunami recovery in Thailand was very quick. Within weeks, beaches were cleaned up, buildings were repaired, and the reconstruction process was begun. Many of the resorts were back in business by February 2005. For Phuket, the tourist industry is a mainstay of the economy, and it was essential to get this up and running as quickly as possible. However, getting the tourists back was not necessarily going to be easy.
We have put in place very strong emergency procedures for tsunami, and we are offering in the moment very attractive rate on the Thai market and on the international market.
The Thai economy is more robust than that of many of the other tsunami-affected nations. The government injected funds into the economy to help restore tourism, backed by extensive advertising, and was an early proponent of the tsunami warning system. Even so, tourists have been slow to return. Phuket has made the strongest recovery, but locals talk about what they call the economic tsunami. 2005's tourism revenue plunged, and it will take many years to recover. In Thailand, as in so many countries, the pain of the tsunami still lingers. Of the 5,000 deaths in Thailand, almost 2,000 were in the province of Phang Nga. 5 years after the tsunami, thousands of locals in a small Phang Nga fishing village took part in a memorial for the many who had died.
5 ปีที่ผ่านไปในความรู้สึกของเราที่เราก็ยังอะไรเขาอยู่นะคะแต่เมื่อเรามีเหตุการณ์ผ่านมาเราก็ต้องตั้งสติให้ได้เราก็ปรับปรุงตัวเองให้อยู่ได้กับภัยธรรมชาติที่มันจะเกิดขึ้นต่อไป
Mourners paid tribute to loved ones, and Buddhist, Christian and Muslim ceremonies were held with prayers for those who had died.
มันก็ยังลืมไม่ได้ครับยังคิดถึงอยู่นั้นนะคิดถึงแต่แม่กับน้องๆในร้านกันโดยมากร้านกันผมจะเลี้ยงเองมาตลอดผมว่าไปกับเพื่อนตอนนั้นต่อตาผม
The waves swept away so much that mattered dearly. Loved ones, communities, even a sense of place and belonging. The 2004 tsunami will remain a painful memory for years to come for people all around the world. No matter what we might wish, we cannot dodge natural disasters. We can't prevent another earthquake or another tsunami. But we can at least learn from the past. We can be prepared, and we can hope that this will make the next time a little less painful. One of the deadliest storms in United States history struck the nation's southern coast in August 2005. Hurricane Katrina rampaged through Gulf Coast communities, leaving a trail of death, destruction, and dislocation. The magnitude of the disaster made it the most destructive hurricane in history.
It's all gone. It's devastating. It looks like someone nuked the place.
Several coastal areas were badly affected, but the states of Louisiana and Mississippi suffered the worst loss of life. The low-lying city of New Orleans became mostly submerged when the defense levees failed and storm surges and floodwaters inundated the city. Residents drowned or became marooned in their homes, trapped by the deep, dirty water. In the immediate aftermath, residents struggled to find essential supplies, particularly drinking water. Food, too, was almost non-existent. People had lost their homes and everything in them. They had nothing left, no place to go. Thousands of people were dislocated, forced to evacuate their homes ahead of the hurricane. They sought refuge in neighboring states, reliant on emergency aid, and cramped into sporting arenas that doubled as vast dormitories. For days, people remained stranded by the floodwaters until rescuers plucked them to safety. But for many, help was too late arriving. Well before the waters receded, Hurricane Katrina exposed an underbelly of mismanagement, political maneuvering, and social failures. This was a disaster much worse than it should have been. Thousands of desperate people sought refuge in sporting arenas, where lack of supplies and sanitation became serious problems. Here, they waited for aid to finally reach them, but it was a long time coming.
Hurricane Katrina is now designated a Category 5 hurricane. We cannot stress enough the danger this hurricane poses to Gulf Coast communities. I urge all citizens to put their own safety and the safety of their families first by moving to safe ground.
On Saturday, the 27th of August, a steady stream of cars left New Orleans. As no public transport was operating, many thousands, mainly poor, elderly, and infirm, remained behind, stranded. The next day, evacuation was mandatory. The Superdome was prepared for those staying with special needs.
It's 11 o'clock on Sunday. As you can see, this is what the hurricane is.
Doesn't look good,
Doesn't look good. We are here.
When Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana early on the Monday morning, it was already a killer. It had left 14 dead in Florida on the Friday, before gathering strength over the ocean for its Category 3 to 4 assault on Louisiana. It rushed into land with winds of over 200 kilometers an hour, pounding and smashing all in its path. The angry gales whipped up walls of water, meters high, that smashed to the ground and ran like rivers through the streets. It raged for hours, dumping torrents of rain, swelling the rivers, lakes, and wetlands.
The highest winds and highest storm surge are occurring now or have already occurred along the coast. Gradually will be subsiding later today. The threat now shifts inland, where the risk for tornadoes, freshwater flooding, and strong winds will be moving northward through Mississippi and into and farther north from there.
The hurricane moved on, but New Orleans' troubles were just beginning. Within hours, nearly all the city's main levees gave way, leaving no defense against the incoming floods. Most of New Orleans was underwater, and it would be weeks before the waters subsided.
We have no electricity, no water, can't go outside, can't really leave the building, can't really leave our room.
The day before the hurricane hit New Orleans, the city's mayor had expressed his belief that we're facing the storm most of us have feared. He was right. The fast waters quickly reached depths well over people's heads, and hundreds drowned in the sudden onslaught. Bodies were seen floating along in the water, and many were later discovered when the streets eventually dried out. In some areas, waters reached the tops of houses, leaving no chance for survival. People sought refuge on the highest ground they could find, even in treetops. Several of the roads and a major bridge were badly damaged, severely limiting access from outside for relief and rescue, and many of the city's buildings had suffered major structural damage.
We've been taken from our hotel to the Superdome in an army truck along with everybody else. There's about 20,000 people here, not too friendly people either. It's quite scary, and at this point we don't know what the hell we're going to do to get out of here.
22,000 tense and desperate people squeezed together into the Superdome. It was often ugly, with violence, rapes, and murders. As the weather cleared in New Orleans, the extent of the devastation became clear. Little of the city was left unscathed. 2 days after Katrina hit Louisiana and Mississippi, President Bush cut short his holiday, flying over the Gulf Coast area and seeing the destruction for himself.
The vast majority of New Orleans, Louisiana is underwater. Tens of thousands of homes and businesses are beyond repair. A lot of the Mississippi Gulf Coast has been completely destroyed. Mobile is flooded. We are dealing with one of the worst natural disasters in our nation's history.
The combination of extreme winds, flooding, and water surges meant that the hurricane's impact was felt everywhere. Thousands of homes were destroyed, water was everywhere it shouldn't be, and the damage bill unimaginable. In the immediate aftermath, thousands of New Orleans residents were stranded by the floods, some trapped inside buildings, on rooftops, and in trees. The Coast Guard and Louisiana Fisheries and Wildlife were early on the scene, and despite their limited numbers, rescued many. But New Orleans was on the brink of civil breakdown, and it was essential to get people out as soon as possible. Governor Blanco ordered a large contingent of buses to begin ferrying people out, sending them to Houston's Astrodome. The Texas-based USS Baton had been brought in to nearby waters before Katrina hit, in readiness for early relief work. It now provided helicopters for rescue missions and medical evacuations, as well as having its onboard hospital on standby. The helicopter work was vital to the overall operation. The Coast Guard rescued more than half of the 60,000 stranded, lowering rescue baskets and lifting people to safety one at a time. The Coast Guard's achievements were noted with an official entry in the Congressional Record. In Mississippi, military aircraft brought in supplies and ferried evacuees to the nearby international airport. With priority given to the sick and injured, over the next 5 days, 40,000 were airlifted out to safety. With the waters still rising, there were fears that thousands could be trapped in houses amongst the floodwaters. Rescuers took on the almost impossible task of checking all the flooded streets in search of survivors. Government agencies manned boats in a race against the clock, joined by a large contingent of volunteers who had brought their own boats in from other areas. Patiently, they ferried people to safety and headed back in search of more, repeating the trip time and again, rewarded with the knowledge they'd saved a life. But it was also frustrating. Incredibly, when rescuers did find people alive, many refused to leave their homes, though they were breeding grounds for disease. The surrounding water was contaminated with dead bodies, floating debris, oil, and human waste. National Guardsmen went from house to house, persuading people to leave. Already, the toll from disease was mounting, and time was running out. In the first couple of days, emergency services had received many calls from people trapped in their homes. Now, as each day ticked by, the chances of finding them alive grew slim.
They've taken hours after hours to get here. We've been waiting hours, and the sun is beaming, it's real hot, it's stinking out here. It's just disgusting and frustrating. And we are human beings, and they're treating us like we're criminals.
For thousands of evacuees, time was also a problem. Emergency services had underestimated the need for food, water, and medical supplies, and they had run out quickly. It was a full 5 days after the hurricane before more stocks arrived. In the meantime, several people had gone 3 days without food or water. People were starting to become ill and dying.
Why weren't you people doing this days ago?
So that's just it, we were doing this days ago.
But you weren't here on the ground,
no.
You weren't organizing the crowds.
We couldn't get here.
Why not? You're soldiers.
Well, the thing is, I mean, there's water. If there's water, we can't get to it. You have to realize places like this were underwater 2 days ago.
But if I can get here, then you can get here. You've got a helicopter, I haven't.
Well, we can't land a helicopter everywhere we are. I mean, you have to realize just because you see this open field doesn't mean it's a place to land a helicopter. There's power lines, there's wires, there's buildings.
The emergency response was under the control of the federal emergency body, FEMA. From the outset, it was poorly organized, bureaucratic, and territorial. Its decisions hindered the relief process, refusing offers of food, water, transport, and specialist volunteers. President Bush was also criticized, having appointed FEMA's inexperienced chief, and claiming no one knew the levees might fail when this had in fact been discussed with him.
Now we have images of a president and a White House clueless about what was going on, saying things like we didn't have any idea that the levees could break. That just simply don't meet the test.
And Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director is working 24 hours.
Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi has called for your resignation, and I'm wondering if you have a response to that.
The president's in charge of that, not me.
Have you ever offered your resignation?
Pardon?
Did you offer your resignation at any time?
I serve totally at the will of the President of the United States.
The reaction of the Bush administration in the past to failures in policy has been to close ranks and even give medals to people who clearly did not perform. There's nothing this administration hates more than to admit errors on its own part. So there's going to be a strong inclination not to fire anybody, not to accept blame. And of course, we're already seeing fingers pointed at Kathleen Blanco and the governor of Louisiana and the mayor of New Orleans.
Relief efforts everywhere were wanting.
You were here yesterday as well?
Yes.
And no food and no water?
No food or water. And they're out of water as far as I know.
This is pretty desperate.
Yeah.
For the many evacuees reliant on emergency aid, it was still a waiting game, even for those who'd moved to neighboring cities.
So when do you think you'll go back to New Orleans?
I'm not going back.
Never?
No.
What did you see?
I saw a little girl get raped.
Where?
In Gentilly. We were staying in this hotel.
After the hurricane?
After the hurricane. So I'm not going back.
The influx of displaced people into some of these cities wasn't always popular.
We've doubled our population in a matter of a couple of days, and you know, new folks in the area makes everybody a little uneasy.
I think it's really smart to have something to protect yourself, and I just haven't had a pistol in years, and I feel the need for it right now.
In Baton Rouge, the state's capital, the city's new residents found it a struggle to find accommodation. They also struggled to cope with their sorrow, as over time, an increasing number of bodies were gradually recovered from New Orleans. So many, in fact, that the state had to set up a temporary morgue. Yet still many did not know the fate of their loved ones. Texas, too, had taken in many of the displaced. Most of the people who'd been in New Orleans Superdome had been bussed out in the early days and sent to stay in the Houston Astrodome. Here they waited for permanent accommodation, but that could be quite a while. In this sea of humanity, everyone lived with uncertainty, wondering what was to become of them, where they might end up. But far more pressing was the concern for missing loved ones. Sometimes, rarely, there were joyful reunions, but mostly it was a waiting game, pinning hopes to a notice board.
There is no future. Nobody have future. We don't have a home, but we don't care. We want her to be alive and her daughter. That's all we want. We want her back.
Behind each and every hand-scrawled slip of paper lay someone's personal tragedy.
Hometown is just wiped away right now, and I'm looking for my whole family.
And there were personal struggles. One man had to strap his disabled wife and child to the roof of his house, waiting 3 days to be rescued.
At night, the mosquitoes would come out, roaches crawling everywhere all on you. My children scared, my wife scared, and all I could do is talk to them and comfort them.
The evacuation scattered Katrina's victims far and wide into 50 different states. In the process, families were split up, children separated from parents and siblings. Gradually, some are managing to find each other and reconnect, due to support services provided by the Red Cross and technology companies to create a searchable database. But still, after so many years, nothing is permanent. The reconstruction process is taking a long time, and many no longer know where they belong.
It's still a slow process, because you got a whole city here, you know what I'm saying? We don't have nothing to go home to, nothing.
Without the help that we are getting here, I don't know what we would have done. The people in Houston really stepped up. They stepped up big time to help us.
Many are likely to stay right where they are.
In Mississippi, the storm wiped out virtually everything along an 80-mile stretch of the coast, flattening homes and destroying entire communities. In Louisiana, flooding left 80% of the city of New Orleans underwater. The human costs were even more terrible. Unfortunately, Katrina also revealed that federal, state, and local governments were unprepared to respond to such an extraordinary disaster. And the floodwaters exposed the deep-seated poverty that has cut people off from the opportunities of our country. So last year I made a simple pledge. The federal government would learn the lessons of Katrina, we would do what it takes, and we would stay as long as it takes to help our brothers and sisters build a new Gulf Coast where every citizen feels part of the great promise of America. This pledge meant stronger levees and rebuilt homes and new infrastructure. It also means safe streets and neighborhoods filled with locally owned businesses and more opportunities for everyone. Next week, Laura and I will return to Mississippi and New Orleans to meet with local citizens and officials and review the progress we have made.
Restaurants are open. All the good Louisiana food out there is ready to be eaten. We just need to get the positive message out to get the tourists back in town.
New Orleans may be very slowly getting to its feet, but its former citizens will need to be convinced there is genuine improvement.
We got to build strong levees that can withstand a Category 5 hurricane to make this place safe for people to come back and want to be able to come back. So we'll see. We'll see if they're going to leave us twisting in the wind or help us out.
The levees remain a sore point, and while their original engineering and construction has been found at fault, that doesn't appear to be likely to change things.
What we're authorized to do right now is, Congress authorizes us to build it, is to the pre-Katrina levels.
Well, that's not going to be any good, is it? Because people aren't going to come back if it's just the way it was in terms of what it can withstand.
That remains to be seen. But I'm just telling you that's what we're authorized to do. And each individual have to make that decision upon, based on, the risk that they want to take.
But New Orleans has a certain magnetism about it.
But the people haven't got power, or water, or even houses that are standing, so how are you going to bring them back?
Well, I don't think it's a magic wand. This is not Disneyland. But what I'm advising is for people to come back, start the rebuild process for you to come back and live permanently.
Several years after Katrina, residents are still living in trailers, and the city is mainly populated by construction workers. Interestingly, independent housing projects, such as the Brad Pitt Green Homes, are proving more efficient and popular than traditional housing.
I don't think it should take 3 or 4 years to rebuild New Orleans, which I really think in my head, like from what I see, it's gonna take that long. Because I've been down here for maybe 8 months. So I know from the change, from what I've seen from how long I've been down here and how it done changed and how it done got better, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, we still got a lot of killings and stuff going on for little stupid stuff, which shouldn't be happening because y'all rebuilding,
Hurricane Katrina had a terrible impact on the people of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida, and it has affected the lives of people in most parts of the United States. New Orleans is a city that always had a heart and soul and captured an essence of America that was distinctly its own. It had a pride too, but much of that pride was stripped away in the aftermath of Katrina, when people felt forgotten and marginalized. Whether that can be all restored along with the city remains to be seen, but there is a goodwill out there that wants to see it work. Who knows, maybe New Orleans will prove to be the field of dreams. If we build it, they will come.
The frantic disbelief heard on this amateur video captures the distress and shock that embraced Haiti on January 12, 2010, as a monumental earthquake left in its wake thousands dead, thousands homeless, and a country crippled.
The world is coming to an end!
The devastation was followed by desperate rescue attempts through rubble and debris, mass confusion and profound grief, as the reality of the earthquake's tragedy slowly unfolded. An estimated 3 million people were affected by the quake. Almost 250,000 were killed, 300,000 injured, and 1 million made homeless. Desperate muffled cries were heard from deep inside the wrecks of buildings, many that had been poorly built and unable to withstand the smallest impact, let alone the force of an earthquake. Survivors squatted in the streets, some hurt and bloody, with many more left without food and water, as they sat dazed, close to piles of covered corpses and rubble. The wounded were taken to hospital in ambulances, police pickup trucks, wheelbarrows, and improvised stretchers, and as many hospitals had collapsed, treatment areas struggled to cope. In tragic circumstances, the earthquake's aftermath focused the world spotlight on a poverty-stricken country that had previously been ignored by an indifferent international community.
A hospital ship is a must for us now because some of our hospitals have been affected, collapsed also, so we need that kind of support.
As the impact of the earthquake became apparent, the United Nations warned of a humanitarian disaster. Yet in the days that followed the disaster, only a trickle of aid filtered through, as aid agencies soon realised the magnitude of the disaster outweighed anything they had faced before. World leaders pledged hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of troops, yet the delivery of this became a logistical nightmare. For weeks, relief came in the form of food giveaways, with desperate people vying for the rations as they arrived to be distributed.
For a country and a people who are no strangers to hardship and suffering, this tragedy seems especially cruel and incomprehensible.
A month on from the tragedy, Haiti's situation was dire, as the need for food, shelter, medical supplies, and basic security was enormous. Makeshift tent villages were set up to house the homeless, and it was feared expected rains would result in deadly flash floods that would sweep people away and breed deadly diseases such as malaria and cholera, as water mixed with the fetid combination of mud and human waste.
The two big challenges, the two top priorities for the moment, which you'll be well aware of, I think, are shelter and sanitation, and obviously they are linked. It is urgent to get everybody with some kind of reasonably waterproof covering over their heads, whether it be a tent or tarpaulins.
6 months after the earthquake, little had changed, and it appeared the earthquake could have struck yesterday.
We may well be talking of anything up to $13 or $14 billion of damages, and of course reconstruction needs is somewhat different to damages. Damages tends to focus on trying to replace things that were there, but as many people have said, what you want to do is build back better and provide better infrastructure and more advanced, better quality buildings, of course, that are more earthquake and hurricane proof.
Until the earthquake struck, Haiti had barely registered on the world media radar, despite reoccurring political instability that had critically increased the poverty level and led to the decline of the economy. It was deemed the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, with 85% of the population living under the poverty line. A string of disturbing statistics highlighted the dire conditions Haitians lived in, with half of the children under 5 years suffering from malnutrition, and the rate of women who died in childbirth the highest in the world. Special UN peacekeepers, the Minister, had been in Haiti since the early 90s, dealing with political unrest. These too were devastated by the quake, as more than 100 peacekeepers, including 2 of the Minister's senior leaders, were killed. On January 12, 2010, in Port-au-Prince, as the quake struck, the only recorded footage of the earthquake was filmed by terrified onlookers.
The world is coming to an end!
The immediate aftermath of the earthquake saw a desperate scramble for survivors in the blinding chaos. The devastation was overwhelming as survivors struggled to absorb its impact with disbelief, shock and fear. As people desperately tried to make sense of the catastrophe, the country was left without hospitals in its capital city, with no electricity and phone services, little water supply and damaged transport routes. Survivors squatted in the street, many injured and bloody, while nearby dead bodies lay strewn among the debris and rubble. Limbs protruded from disintegrated concrete, and muffled cries were heard deep inside the wreck of buildings. It was a heartbreaking catastrophe. Thousands of people lay trapped in the rubble of government buildings, foreign aid offices and shanty towns. Almost immediately, morgue facilities were overwhelmed, and in the heat and humidity, the acrid stench of human decay permeated the air. Dead bodies were placed on the streets until government trucks collected them and buried them in mass graves. The number of dead was beyond comprehension. The extent of the destruction and Haiti's fragile infrastructure before the earthquake made its impact all the worse. As the country had no building codes, it was unlikely structures could have handled any impact. Before the disaster, the country already suffered from fuel and water shortages.
We saw people that died, and we saw that the hospitals were full of wounded people, and in some cases you could just see that they would not have long to live.
The UN suffered a devastating blow as its headquarters in Port-au-Prince collapsed, killing its mission head and deputy head and leaving 150 in total dead. Several other UN facilities were damaged, which caused havoc with early rescue missions, as the UN was forced to focus on rescuing its own personnel before it could help with the plight of the Haitian people. Haiti is part of the West Indies archipelago, bounded on the north by the Atlantic Ocean, on the east by the Dominican Republic, the south by the Caribbean Sea, and the west by a channel separating it from Cuba. Since its existence was first recorded when Christopher Columbus named the island Hispaniola, Little Spain, in 1492, the country has had a turbulent political history. By 1804, Haiti was independent of France and had installed a former slave as emperor. Several power struggles followed until 1956, the year that heralded the long leadership of the dictator Francois Papadoc Duvalier. A former Minister of Health and Labour, Papadoc seized power in a military coup and declared himself president a year later. A strong believer in the rights of the Haitian black majority, he advanced black interests in the public sector. By the mid-60s, with the help of Tonton's Makute militia, he had declared himself president for life. The volunteer military organisation increased Duvalier's support base and recruited many farmers from rural areas throughout the country. The Tonton Makute's members were responsible for many violent acts throughout Haiti. As Papadoc forced the exodus of intellectual and professional people, many other countries benefited from the university professors, medical doctors, administrators and professionals who had left Haiti. Papadoc's rule was extreme, and he used the people's belief in voodoo to his advantage. He enforced his rule through terror, and under his leadership the elite became richer and the poor suffered. Initially, the United States turned a blind eye to Duvalier, but President Kennedy decided his reign was an embarrassment to the region and offered support to anyone wanting to overthrow the despot. However, any attempts were unsuccessful, and Duvalier died peacefully in his bed and designated his son, Jean-Claude Duvalier, as Haiti's new leader, beginning the rule of Baby Doc. At 19, Baby Doc became the youngest president in the world. Haiti fell into further disrepair, and Jean-Claude Duvalier fled the country in the face of growing unrest at his leadership. In 1990, Haiti welcomed its first free and peaceful vote, one that installed Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a former priest, as president. However, this promise of stability and hope was short-lived, as Aristide was overthrown in a military coup in 1991. With the backing of the US, Aristide was returned to power in Haiti in 1994, until he stepped down in 1996. He was then re-elected in 2001, but ousted once again in a bloody rebellion in 2004. In August and September of 2008, Haiti was slammed, first by Hurricane Gustave and then Hurricane Ike, leaving the country reeling. The storms killed over 100 people, left countless casualties, and caused severe flooding and widespread devastation to the country, deepening a food crisis that left many in the region vulnerable to disease and malnutrition. As the smell of decaying bodies filled the air, people in the street covered their mouths to protect themselves from the stench that was unavoidable from every angle. The sound of desperate calls for help from collapsed buildings became silent. There was little prospect of rescue, and many perished in the rubble. People became almost immune to the sight of dead bodies, piled up in the streets, and quickly hurried past. Haiti had run out of body bags, the morgues were full, and there was nowhere else to put the growing piles of corpses.
We ain't got no help right now. We thought United States or them other countries was gonna come in and help us, but we ain't see no one coming yet. But right now we need some help to carry them dead bodies and try to throw them away somewhere and to bury them, or we need some water, some food, everything. We need some medicine, right now.
Haiti streets were lined with destruction as house after house was destroyed by the earthquake, and there was little to show of the home that had existed before. In some cases, bodies protruded from the rubble, but only specialist equipment could now remove them. Police officers patrolled the areas to maintain order and keep looters away.
This is evacuation, man. Code red, man. There's nothing out here, man. People dying, man. It's a shame, man. I'm not saying y'all supposed to help right away, you know what I mean? But start doing something so that people can have courage.
Doctors at makeshift hospitals were completely overwhelmed with the volume of patients and injuries. Many serious injuries were overlooked and left untreated because there was no way to help all of the casualties. Urgent medical help was needed, but it was not available. Miraculous tales of survival were celebrated. Somehow, dozens of students survived the collapse of a school building, yet the identity of those who didn't could only be found by searching through school bags. Many were missing, presumed dead.
His bag is here, sorry.
Every time a death was confirmed, the grief was unbearable for those left alive. UN peacekeepers were able to filter some aid through as part of the airport remained functional. While survivors lined the streets waiting for meagre rations, the peacekeepers remained on hand to maintain order as the need for food and water had become desperate. The world's relief agencies tried desperately to get hundreds of tons of emergency supplies to Haiti. These supplies included food parcels, tents and medicines, as well as heavy lifting equipment, communication gear, and stored at Oxfam's huge warehouse, everything needed for emergency water supply, such as pipes, pumps, tanks and taps. The relief effort was a massive logistical operation. Many aid agencies had learned from previous disasters throughout the world, such as the 2004 Asian tsunami, where there had been an enormous amount of confusion.
After the tsunami, which had an enormous amount of confusion connected to it, there was a new system developed by the UN called a cluster approach, so that this brought the UN agencies, the NGOs together, and all the other players. Health, logistics, nutrition, protection, education, water, sanitation, hygiene and all those, all have a cluster approach, all have a cluster lead, and all the agencies dealing with those particular areas will deal with that cluster lead to ensure that we have a coordinated approach.
Although relief supplies were arriving at Port-au-Prince Airport, the airport had been damaged, and in some cases, non-military flights were suspended, which forced some chartered aid flights to turn back. Spaces to park planes on the tarmac became limited, and alternative ways to deliver supplies was vital. Moored offshore was the US vessel the Carl Vinson. It had a fully equipped hospital, water production facilities, and 19 helicopters on board. The only other route to deliver aid was by road from the Dominican Republic, a painfully slow option. Resolving these logistical issues was the cluster coordinator's job, as was making sure aid agencies didn't duplicate their efforts and waste valuable time. Agencies agreed on standards so every different country's provisions were compatible. Through this, the Water, Sanitation and Hygiene Cluster, known as WASH, was devised.
All the signs at the moment are that despite the confusion you're seeing, there is an element of coordination going on already. There's meetings every single day at 3 o'clock at the moment in the Ministry of Water in Port-au-Prince, in the offices which have not been too badly damaged. So that all water and sanitation agencies will go to that meeting and they will coordinate how they best respond. Gaps in parts of the town which don't have agencies working in will be directed to those parts.
Presidents past and present were a united front at the White House to show their support for the plight of Haiti and the US's biggest ever relief effort.
At this moment, we're moving forward with one of the largest relief efforts in our history to save lives and to deliver relief that averts an even larger catastrophe.
America's top diplomat, Hillary Clinton, arrived in Haiti amid plane loads of aid from throughout the world. She called the disaster biblical. Bulldozers were being used by United Nations troops to lift the multitudes of dead on the streets, and heavy machinery was being used to clean up collapsed buildings. This left anyone who managed to remain alive in the rubble little chance of survival. Surviving Haitians appeared stunned as they struggled on amid the ruins of a country torn apart by the disastrous earthquake. As a country, Haiti had weathered revolution and hurricanes, yet nothing on this massive scale. By the end of January, a new food distribution program from the United Nations aimed to repair a faltering aid effort. Paper coupons that were able to be redeemed for 55 pounds of rice were introduced and became more valuable than Haitian money. It was one way of easing confusion surrounding distribution of aid, where it was estimated only a third of those who needed food was receiving it. Rarely had anyone seen a natural disaster ravage a country already poverty-stricken with such force.
Oui, nous menons l'hôpital, nous pas de médicaments. Pas de médicaments pour lui. C'est nous-mêmes qui avons nous des petits graines. Ça est petit moi qui fait des pansements ça pour lui.
On avait allé à l'hôpital avec cette petite-là jeudi dernier. On a seulement donné de l'ampicilline, mais on n'a pas d'autres moyens pour. On n'a pas même examiné parce que presque toutes les infirmières, les médecins ont été morts.
The aid effort remained chaotic. Survivors scavenged for food, shelter, water and medicine, all within sight of one of the biggest aid efforts in history. With most of the aid coming through the airport run by the American military, relief agencies accuse them of favouring their troops and their supplies over aid.
I see their frustration every day. I feel their frustration. Are we doing enough? Absolutely not. Are we going to do more? And when I say we, it's not just the United States, obviously, it's the entire international community.
But people 200 meters from the airport aren't getting enough food. They're not getting any food.
Well, I'll take that back in. That's a piece of data that I didn't know.
No aid had left the only US relief ship to arrive in Haiti. The international aid effort was jammed, and this proved to be deadly as aftershocks brought more casualties to already overwhelmed hospitals, desperately in need of fresh supplies. Supplies that were not getting through. Relief agencies said Haitians were dying because the international community was not delivering on its promises.
And this is a disaster really of quite exceptional proportions for a country like Haiti. In relation to Haiti's size, its population or its economic income, it's really a terrible tragedy, one of the worst events that the world has seen for a country proportionate to the country's size. We may well be talking of anything up to $13 or $14 billion of damages, and of course reconstruction needs is somewhat different to damages. Damages tends to focus on trying to replace things that were there, but as many people have said, what you want to do is build back better and provide better infrastructure and more advanced, better quality buildings, of course, that are more earthquake and hurricane proof.
bientôt je vais dire de ça. L'essentiel, c'est le président américain qui te dit un bagage que il pour rebâtir le pays, tout simplement. Je ne sais pas pour le gouvernement haïtien, si dans mes yeux, des catastrophes qui passent. Mais s'il y a une opportunité, je me suppose qu'il a aidé chaque haïtien à vivre dans le pays.
As the struggle to recover from the devastation continued, more than 1,000 Haitians died from a cholera outbreak in November 2010. A cruel setback in an ongoing recovery.